This will be the final chapter, Chapter 6, and conclusion in the book What a Plant Knows, A Field Guide to the Senses by Daniel Chamovitz. Chapter 6 is What a Plant Remembers. So no, we're not saying that plants might have brains, but we did see that they remembered the last color they saw earlier, and we also know they know if they're being chewed and have a variety of other responses to their senses. And sometimes that involves a delayed response. And so do we consider a delayed response to a previous occurrence equivalent to a memory? Here's an example. Scientist noticed that he could cut off pea tendrils. Tendrils are the little tiny modified leaf parts that will wrap around a fence or a post or something to help hold the pea plant erect. It was observed that if the tendrils were cut off and kept well lit and moist, then they would still curl when they were rubbed. And the curling response is what they do in the intact state. When they detect they've touched something, then they curl quickly to try and grab hold of something, so that that they are then anchored to it. So we observe that if they're well lit and moist, they would still behave as they do when they're attached to the plant, as long as they were in the light. If they were in the dark, though, they didn't respond to the rubbing. So something about being in the dark inhibited that response. However, if even as long as 2 hours later they were then placed in the light, then they would curl. So they remembered that they had been rubbed, the stimulus had occurred, and 2 hours later, when the conditions were right, they went ahead and reacted to that stimulus. To look at what memory is, or definitions of memory, one example or one thought is that there's 3 kinds of human memory: procedural, semantic, and episodic. The episodic would be a personal memory, like your vacation or your birthday when you were 10, or some event that occurred that was momentous enough to think about years later. Semantic is learned information, so you take a botany class and years later you still know the difference between the leaf and a root. And procedural is how to do something. So you know how to swim, you know how to do somersaults, some things that you have learned physically or otherwise. So number 2 and number 3 obviously are not going to fit for plants. They're not looking back to the days when they were a seedling. But number 1, you could apply it to the pea tendrils. The plants sensed the touch, they remembered it for a couple hours, and then when the conditions are right, they responded and they coiled. There are many other levels of memory. Sensory, such as we get from our senses, touch or sight or whatever, oral. Short-term memory is stuff you recently encountered, so you can remember the color of the car you passed 2 seconds ago, but by the time you get to your destination, you've forgotten that. Remember a phone number long enough to dial it, kind of thing. Long-term are your stored memories, the memories that you can bring back years later. Additionally, there's muscle motor activities, so like gymnasts, their bodies learn how to do incredibly complicated activities. And then additionally, there is immune memory, so your immune system reacts to pollen or a virus or something, and then years later that memory is still retained within your immune system, so that if you get the same pollen or the same virus, you get a reaction. And these all have 3 things in common. They have an encoding phase, retention phase, and a retrieval phase. So let's apply that to the Venus flytrap. The flytraps don't want to just snap shut every time there's a possibility that they might have an insect in their trap. It's energetically expensive, and they live sort of on the edge anyway. They don't have a lot of resources to waste. So evolution steps in and has created a system that the traps don't shut unless 2 specialized hairs of about 6 that are on each trap get triggered within 20 seconds of each other. So this would be an insect, you're going to bump against one, and then it's still in there walking around. 20 seconds later, it's going to bump against the other. So the insect is still there, and it's large enough that it's been able to trigger the hairs. So, and therefore, it's worth clamping shut for the for the plant. So we could call sensing that first hair encoding and storing the second for the fact that that has been triggered for 20 seconds is retention. And then when the second hair does get triggered, recalling that this is the second hair, not the first hair, that could be retrieving. To look at it still another way, first we need to know, first we need to realize how the first hair, how the hairs are triggered and what happens between the first and the second. A couple scientists in the 1990s realized that an electric charge is created when the first hair is triggered. And that charge causes a change in the change in the electrical charge causes the calcium transport channels to open up, and that means that the concentration of calcium in the action cells increases. So not enough though to trigger the trap closing, but it does increase, and then it slowly begins decreasing. Then if the second hair is triggered, we get a second burst of calcium going into the cell to give it another spike in concentration. And if there's still enough remaining, enough of the first spike left, the second spike will cause a threshold to be crossed that will result in triggering that trap to shut. So we can look at that as memory. Encoding, encoding would be the equivalent of having the first spike in calcium concentration. And the calcium concentration is the mechanism of the memory. And then retention is keeping the concentration high enough to cause closing if the second hair is triggered within the time window. And then retrieval would be if the two spikes in calcium concentration are enough to cross the threshold, the trap closes. There's another type of memory in plants called morphogenetic memory. Back in the 50s, a scientist noted that when working with a plant that had, he was using flax that has two cotyledons and an apical bud similar to this little diagram. And then, of course, there are two lateral buds at the edge of where each of those leaves comes onto the plant. Normally, the apical bud is dominant and it grows, but if it's cut off, then the two lateral buds begin to grow. What he realized was if he cut off one of the cotyledons before he cut off the apical bud, the only lateral bud that grew was the one that was on the side of the cotyledon that didn't get cut off. And this phenomenon was called morphogenetic memory. Another scientist picked up on this using a different kind of plant. He was using Bidens pilosa. And he didn't even actually remove the cotyledons. He just stabbed them 4 times. But then did the same experiment, then removed the apical bud. And he found that the stabbed plants, the stabbed cotyledon, had the same response. The lateral bud near it didn't grow as well as the lateral bud near the unstabbed cotyledon. And he could vary the time between stabbing and decapitating even by as much as a week and still got the same response. So somehow or other, the plant remembered being wounded. The mechanism of this is still not clear. Cold memory. There was a Russian scientist who was extremely popular in Russia for years for some scientific theories and principles which he expounded on, which were politically correct but weren't actually biologically correct. However, there was a time when the winter wheat crop failed. Normally winter wheat is an extremely important crop for a northern country like the Soviet Union and Russia. It's planted in the fall and germinates, but it stays dormant all winter, and then as soon as the ground begins to warm in the spring, it grows and flowers and produces as a crop. Well, in the 20s they had such warm winters that they didn't get a crop, and it turns out a long cold winter is required in order to trigger flowering in these plants. And so Lysenko discovered putting seeds in the freezer would allow those plants to still flower as soon as possible, even if it had been a mild winter. So this process is called vernalization, and it's common in many plants we know today. And things like, cherry blossoms come out in the early spring in response to a certain, number of dark hours and light hours. But nevertheless, in the fall, when the same the days are the same length as they are in the spring, it doesn't trigger flowering because winter hasn't occurred. You have to have winter and then the right day length, and then they'll flower. So this was the situation in wheat and in many other species. So the response, the flowering response, is triggered because the plants know that winter has happened. So how is a good question, and people are still working it out. But thanks to our friend Arabidopsis, it's found that a certain gene stops flowering until vernalization occurs. So the gene is active, and it is preventing the necessary steps from beginning that would result in flowering. And it's interesting how this gene is regulated. It's an epigenetic effect, in which case it's not a genetic change, but it's a change to the genetic material. The DNA in a cell is wound up very tightly, and there are a wide variety of ways that the DNA is sort of kept tightly wound up so that it doesn't become tangled, and so that it can get open to be translated. What's been discovered is that vernalization causes the DNA for the flower repressing gene to be wound up tighter, so that the gene is no longer active and the suppression of flowering is repressed. So the exact mechanism of that is still being worked out. There's different chemicals called histones and other things that are methylated in certain ways that affect this winding or affect this compaction of the DNA. But once vernalization occurs, then the flowering can happen, and but then the repressing gene needs to be reactivated, and so that the plants don't flower again in the fall, and that is still being worked out. This is as far as we've gotten. So memories. We've seen that plants can remember. They can remember being touched. They can remember being pruned or damaged. They know whether their hairs have been triggered, and they know if winter has happened. So these examples very much for the definitions of sort of entry-level primitive memories. So if we're going to say that we've got memories, then are we going to call them intelligent? After all, we now know they can see different light wavelengths and respond. They can detect gases in their environment and respond. They can react to touch and respond. They know up from down. They know if gravity has changed. And now we know they can remember past events and respond with physiological changes. So obviously, it's a stretch to call them intelligent, but we certainly can call them aware. Probably could call them acutely aware of their environment. They're very aware, but they do not have a brain. They don't suffer. They don't feel happy or sad or glad. They don't remember being a seed. So they can sense their environment and respond to an enormous degree, but they don't care. They don't have the human level of memory, of sensing. So to quote the last paragraph in Daniel Chamovitz's What Plants Know, so the next time you find yourself on a stroll through a park, take a second to ask yourself, what does that dandelion in the lawn see? What does the grass smell? Touch the leaves of oak and know that that tree will remember it was touched, but it won't remember you. You, on the other hand, can remember this particular tree and carry the memory of it with you forever. And that concludes our review of the book, What a Plant Knows.